we will start the next session. The speaker is Kevin Donovan, so you have half an hour.
Great. So thanks so much for having me. This is joint work with Wyatt Brooks and Terry Johnson, and it's actually great to be presenting after Diego because we're going to be after something sort of similar about spillovers, but perhaps differently. We're going to push a little bit harder on the theory and see how far we can go in that dimension. So what we're interested in here is trying to study the cost of distortions that stop firms from learning from each other. The reason we're interested in this is that there's been a bunch of microevidence that suggests these frictions are important. I'll talk more about the details of what these interventions look like, but roughly you should have in mind interventions in which an economist comes in and creates some new opportunities for firms to learn from each other and show relatively promising increases in profit and technology adoption. But we also know that those effects that you see in these RCTs are likely not complete accounting of what would happen if you were to scale a program that facilitates learning between firms. Right, so the idea here is if I meet with Vittorio and Vittorio teaches me something and my profit goes up, that's one thing. But it's another thing if we make it easier for me to then go transfer all of that information to all of you. Right, and so those effects aren't going to be captured in a relatively small scale RCT. Yet, despite that, I mean, that is sort of the ultimate goal, right, is to think about what policies we should be introducing at an aggregate level at scale. And in fact, there's plenty of recent policy work that's been inferring aggregate implications from these micro-interventions. So just to give you an example, the World Bank just introduced a $100 million entrepreneurship project in Malawi. A large part of that is trying to facilitate learning between small and medium enterprises. And when you look at what they're referring to and what they're motivating with, it's all of this micro evidence that I mentioned at the top here. So what we're going to try and do is ask, all right, well, is that the right way to infer aggregate implications from average treatment effects? And if it's not, then what should we be looking for in these smaller scale RCTs? So the way we're going to do that is we're going to lay out a class of models in which learning between firms drives the underlying development process. And we're going to ask within the context of that model, what's the cost of distortions that limit interactions? Now, the problem with that is that it depends on a number of hard-to-measure elasticities in the model. Right? So if I'm thinking about a world in which growth is driven by firms learning from each other, I need to know sort of if I meet Vittorio, how much my profit goes up when I meet him, or how likely it is for me to meet Vittorio or someone else in the economy. Right? And those are things that don't have like a clear counterpart in observational data. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to derive a relationship between key parameters in a relatively broad class of diffusion models. And we're going to link that to microevidence that people have found in these RCTs. And so this is going to be a formalization of the evidence derived from these RCTs and the models that they claim to be motivated by. We're going to use that then going the wrong way. We're going to use that to try and reinterpret what we learn from these smaller scale partial equilibrium experiments. And in particular, sort of the headline thing I'm going to show you is that the average treatment effect derived from those interventions is basically worthless. And what I mean by that is that if you try and extrapolate that average treatment effect, you can get a positive relationship with what would happen if you scale the intervention, a negative relationship, or no effect at all, depending on exactly what the parameters of the world are. Instead, what I'm going to show you is that there's in fact a better moment to look at, and that's easily measured, which is going to look something like a covariance moment that I'll explain in a bit more detail. But roughly what you should have in mind is that this moment is going to better summarize the key aggregate forces in the model, the key equilibrium forces that are driving the at-scale gains, and it's going to do so in a way that makes it a better predictor of what would happen at scale than the average treatment effect. And what's sort of nice about it is it's going to have a very simple OLS interpretation. So it's something you can when you run a partial equilibrium experiment, you can measure it. It's very easy. We do in the paper a bunch more non-parametric extensions to think about complicated stuff. So then we're going to ask, well, okay, so I show you some theoretical results and tell you some things matter, sometimes some things don't. But then we're going to ask you if it has any practical implications. Should you worry about this at all when you're thinking about the relationship between RCTs and at-scale outcomes? And we're going to look at a particular application in Kenya, or if you prefer, a specific application in a country near Uganda, where the treatment is going to be random matches between high and low skilled firms. and we're going to find an average treatment effect of about 19%. So what this means is that if I meet somebody who's much more productive than I am, my profit's going to go up by 19%. The more productive person in the match, they're not going to see any changes in profit. And so we see about a 19% increase in profitability. What I'm going to show you then is that I can derive that 19% average treatment effect in a continuum of economies that are all exactly identical except for two parameters that govern the diffusion process. And importantly, despite the fact that all of these economies generate the exact same treatment effect, the aggregate gains from scaling this same intervention to make it easier for all of us to learn vary between 0.6% and 38%. So the first part of this is to show you some theoretical results. The second part of this is to tell you that this does seem to be a problem quantitatively. When we take the average treatment effect and put it together with this covariance measure I'm going to tell you about, we come to an answer that says the aggregate gains from scaling the same intervention we ran in Kenya would be around 11%. Now, we can argue as much as you want about whether you think 11% is the right number or the wrong number. What I want you to take away from this is that the variation in potential outcomes that you could observe make this a very important problem to be thinking about as you're thinking about like what an average treatment effect tells us. Okay, so what am I going to do just to briefly highlight this? I'm going to lay out part of a diffusion model. It doesn't have to be fully specified, so it's going to cover a bunch of stuff that you've seen in recent literature. I'll try and highlight the importance of some parameters, and then I'll try and link this to microevidence and try and quantify a bit why we think this is important. So here's the world I want you to live in. The world's going to be discrete time, infinite horizon. There's going to be a bunch of firms that have this thing called ability. Ability here is not productivity. If you want, think of it more as like TFPR than TFPQ. In each period, every firm's going to get two shocks. One shock, this Z hat thing, that's going to be what I'm going to call an imitation shock. That's a shock that you get from somebody else in the economy by interacting with them. You adopt that thing if it's profitable for you to do so, otherwise you just disregard it. And then also there's going to be some random innovation to your ability, which I'm just going to call epsilon. I'm going to make the assumption that that thing is uncorrelated with the abilities, but it doesn't have to be IID across people. So they can be correlated shocks across people. On top of that, I'm going to build three more assumptions. The first assumption tells me how Z evolves. And so the law of motion for Z is going to follow this form right here. It's going to be a little tough because I can't point to it, but bear with me for a second. If you just forget about that max operator there, that's just an AR1 process where rho is the mean reversion. C is a drift term, and then again, epsilon is that variation, or the random innovations. And then the diffusion is all coming from that thing in the max operator. So what that says is if the person I meet with has higher ability than I do, so Z hat over Z is bigger than 1, I get to internalize that ability with some semi-elasticity beta. Right? So if beta is 0, that turns off all the diffusion in the world. If beta is 1, you get a lot of diffusion. I can basically become the smart person. Okay? So the two parameters here I want you to really keep an eye on are going to be rho and beta. They're also, all the assumptions are going to be down there on the bottom if you forget them and if you can see them. The second assumption, so that's an assumption on a technology in the model. That's telling me like what happens to ability over time. The last two assumptions are going to be made on equilibrium outcomes from the model. So I'm going to say that in equilibrium, profits are proportional to ability. The firm's profit is proportional to ability. That's a statement that breaks down all the time, but turns out not to be particularly important for us. What we really need is just some way to translate an unobservable thing into observable stuff. Okay? And then the last assumption we're going to make is that the equilibrium source distribution, so this is the distribution from which you draw your match for that period, evolves according to some function m hat, which can depend on your own ability, so people of different abilities can draw from different distributions, and some unknown parameter theta that's going to order this class of distributions in a first-order stochastic dominance sense. So that's a lot of words, but roughly you should think about theta as like your ability to direct your search towards smart people. So the higher theta is, the easier it is for you to find smart people in the economy. Okay? If you're interested in this literature, this covers as a special case basically all of the papers that have been written recently. All right, so here's what we want to do. That's the world I want you to live in. And now what I want to ask is, well, how large are the benefits if we make it easier for everybody to meet smart people? And the way I want you to think about that is a permanent change in this parameter theta. So again, that's the parameter in the source distribution that sort of lets you direct your search towards more productive people. Turns out there's a lot of experiments that do something like this in partial equilibrium. So you can think about this as links between buyers and suppliers. So this is like David Atkin and companies work with rug makers in Egypt. You can think of the Kai and Seidel work that Diego also mentioned, which is random meetings of firm owners in China. We've done some work looking at the relationship between random matching between high and low profit firm managers in Kenya, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out all of these at this level of abstraction are the same thing, which is all of these are a shock to the set of draws that the treatment firms can potentially learn from. So mathematically what that says is for the treatment firms, take that M hat distribution that we assume people are drawing from, on a day-to-day basis, and then replace it with an exogenous distribution that the economist controls that's presumably better. And I'm happy to formalize after what's better means, but at least somebody's going to gain from this. Okay? So what I want to think about now is how that experiment, which actually looks very similar to what I want to do at scale, right? Changing M hat to H hat that's a broader statement, but one of which is a special case is just changing that parameter theta. So what I want to know now is what these partial equilibrium experiments sort of teach me about what would happen if I tried to do this same thing at scale. So the first thing I'm going to do is just try and draw a relationship between parameters of the model and the average treatment effect that you would get out of an RCT. So there's a little bit of math up here. All I want you to take away is that what I'm looking at is the average treatment effect in the data, and I'm going to try and see how that relates to the average treatment effect that you would get out of the model, which after a bit of algebra turns out just to be a function of distributions of profit in the economy. So let me just start with a result that I'll then explain. So it turns out for any parameters beta and rho, there's a unique theta that solves this problem, that makes the model's average treatment effect equal to the data. So let me sort of try and explain why that's true, and a result I'm going to use a little bit going forward. So imagine I run this experiment where I make it really easy for treatment firms to go find smart people. But then let's just say, for the sake of example, that I observe a very small treatment effect. One of two things can be driving that result. The first is that the technology is such that you can't learn from smart people. So I meet Vittorio, he's very, very smart, but the technology is just such that I can't really become Vittorio. So that's one way you could generate those results, a small average treatment effect. But there's another way, which is to say it could be that I meet Vittorio and I gain a lot, but imagine it's already very easy to find him outside of the experiment. That would also imply that the average treatment effect is going to be very small. So if you want, those are the two differences in the diff and diff that is an average treatment effect. But either one of those things can generate the result, which means that there's a continuum. So you tell me what the direct effect is. I can always engineer an extensive margin that can generate the exact same average treatment effect. So that turns out to be sort of a very big problem, because despite the fact that these parameters have the same partial equilibrium treatment effects, those combinations do not generate the same aggregate implications. And so what you need to do is you need to pin down the relative importance of the direct effect relative to this extensive margin, and that's going to let you pin down sort of how important scaling these interventions would be. Okay. So that turns out to be relatively straightforward. You can identify the direct effect parameters by running a regression on the coefficients, by running a regression only on treated firms, where you just regress future profit, or the profit ex post, on baseline profit, and the log of this max function. This is literally just running a regression on the law of motion for ability, using the fact that I can translate that thing into profit. So what's the interpretation of this regression? It's just asking how important is getting a better match, so a different pi hat there, conditional on your baseline profit. Why does this work? Well, the reason it works is that if you create a program in which people are randomly bumping into each other, not only do you have variation between control and treatment, you're also creating variation in what looks like treatment intensity. So some people are meeting with really smart people, some people are meeting with relatively less smart people, and that heterogeneity is what you can exploit to identify these two parameters independent of the extensive margin. Because this is an entire distribution of matches that's entirely controlled by the economists, and has all the randomization that you need. Because again, remember that epsilon doesn't need to be IID. Okay, So that's sort of how you do it, but let me just briefly try and tell you why this moment matters so much. So this parameter beta is this covariance term that I promised was going to be important. And so the way to think about this is that if you think about what's happening in the model, there's sort of two forces that are pushing against each other. One is that there's mean reversion happening, right? So firms are dying, skills are depreciating, and that's sort of pushing the entire economy back down towards the origin, right? The skill distribution is sort of compressing over time. But then there's this other effect, which is that people are learning from each other, and that's pushing people up into the right tail. So you've got this one force that's sort of pushing people down, and then you've got this other force that's pushing people up. And what matters for aggregates is how much mass you can put into that right tail. Right, so it's like you need the tail to be large enough so that you're pulling enough people up to overcome sort of this downward force in the model. So that turns out to be exactly what this beta term is measuring. So if you just assume for a second that everybody's match is better than them in the treatment group, this isn't critical, but it's useful for the math, then you get sort of the usual explanation of what this coefficient should be, which is it's going to measure the covariance of your ex post profit and your match's ex ante profit, normalized by the variation that's fed into the experiment exogenously. Okay? So what that's telling you is exactly what I just explained. It's telling you for a slightly better match, how much more kick do you get in your profit? So how much farther out into the right tail are you being pushed for a given match? Okay? And that's going to, so the rough point here is that that parameter right there is closely connected to the underlying forces that generate aggregate gains, generate general equilibrium gains, and that's the thing you want to be measuring when you're thinking about the relationship between these treatment effects and what would happen at scale. How much time do I have?
14 minutes.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, great. Okay, so that's a bit of theory. Now I want to think about trying to understand this just to sort of see, does this matter quantitatively? Just because something matters or doesn't matter theoretically doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have any practical implications. So we're going to look at a RCT that we ran I guess more than 7 years ago now, in Dandora, Kenya, which is outside of Nairobi, not because we think it's better or worse than any of the other experiments that are doing similar things, just because we have the data on our computer. So what was the experiment? Roughly what you should have in mind is that we do a representative sample of small businesses in Dandora, and then we take some high profit business owners and we randomly have them what we described as mentor low profit business owners. Okay? Now there wasn't sort of topics to discuss, there was sort of some broad sense that this was about business, but roughly, literally what we did, I should say, is that we asked these mentors to come mentor small firms. And then to the smaller firms, we gave them the phone number of the person they were matched with and said, go ahead and call them if you want. And then we tracked their outcomes over 5 quarters. Okay, so here's what the average treatment effect of that intervention looks like. These are in percentage terms. So what this says is that profit goes up by about 40% in the first quarter after the treatment. And you'll notice that it fades out very quickly. So that's a fact we're going to use, and I'm going to test whether our model can handle that, because one sort of quick interpretation of this would be to say, well, why would you be thinking about a model of knowledge diffusion or idea diffusion in the context of an experiment that fades out over 3 quarters? And I'm going to show you that intuition is quite wrong here. So how are we going to use this? We're going to identify things just off the first period, and then I'll take the model and I'll use it to try and replicate this time series. And I'll show you that the model matches the time series pretty well. And so basically you'd get the same results if you use the whole time series to do the identification. So what's going on under the surface here? Some of this, the first couple lines are just a recap of our older paper. The bottom line is some new stuff. The key mechanism seems to be mostly about cost savings. So what we found in the original paper was that treatment firms are 33% more likely to switch suppliers. Their inventory costs go down by about 45%. This is, thinking about this in the context of a treatment effect that fades out quickly is perhaps a bit strange. But the other thing we find is that there's just massive amounts of turnover in supplier-buyer relationships. And so our interpretation of that is that the information has a relatively short half-life, which is a fact that's going to come out of the estimation as well. Now, to try and be a little bit more reasonable about this, the first thing, we're trying to think about whether the diffusion model is sort of the right model to interpret the experiment through. The first thing I'll just mention is that the changes we see do seem to be very much related to something that looks like TFPR. We do a bunch of tests that show that the profit gains we observe are in fact surplus. They're not redistribution between people in the match. They're not sort of people buying bulk goods or anything like that. But then actually a couple years ago we went out and ran a second experiment that replicated everything I just explained to you, but then also had the mentees go and talk to people in the control group afterwards to see if in fact the information persisted. And we find that the characteristics and the profitability of the original mentor have a massive amount of predictive power of how big the second round treatment effect is going to be. That seems to suggest that there's some information that's passing through these people despite the fact that the average treatment effect fades out quickly. It would also be inconsistent with an alternative theory that would be something like, if Vittorio's my mentor, he just comes in and manages my firm for a little bit, and then we break up, and then all the effects goes away. So that type of result would not be consistent with the theory I just explained. So we're going to sort of push ahead trying to use this model. Okay, so let me give you sort of a brief overview of how we're going to close the model to think about quantitative results. I mentioned that the experiment mostly is on cost, so we're going to try and build that idea into the model. And again, we can talk about the realism of the model, but one of the things I want you to take away is sort of, you can do a lot of things under the hood given how broad the identification results are. So you can sort of tweak the model to do what you need it to do, or to the specifics of the economy you're looking at. So think about a world where there's measure one of agents with ability. We're going to allow for some exogenous death. There's occupational choice each period. So you can either be a worker where you get paid some market clearing wage, or you can be a firm that hires those workers and also needs to find a supplier. The supplier margin here is not super interesting, but firms are going to exert effort, and that effort is going to allow you to find a supplier with some marginal cost who you then Nash bargain over with the price. There's a bunch of constant returns in here, so I don't have to, I'm going to assume away a lot of the interesting strategic stuff that like Rocco was talking about in Diego's discussion. What is diffusion? What is ability? So ability here makes it easier to find a supplier. So think about learning information about where suppliers are, et cetera, and then you're going to learn from operating firms who are in the economy about what that process looks like. Okay, I won't show you I can't click on the value function. So, okay, so just to forget about the first bullet, the only thing I want to highlight here is that sort of the key thing and the key general equilibrium effects are all coming out of that ugly looking equation right here. All that's saying is that the distribution of ideas in the economy has to remain consistent with what the learning process is over time. And this model satisfies all of the assumptions that we started with, which means I'm going to be able to estimate those parameters of the diffusion process without the rest of the structure I built around it. So I can pull that out, do it, and then port it into any model that satisfies those three assumptions. So just to give you some sense of what this looks like, here's what that first step looks like. This is estimating the direct effect, so rho and beta. Again, we find a persistence of 59%. It's a little tricky to interpret that relative to models in persistence that don't have diffusion, because that's like a statistical bias that would get introduced. But that is an ability term that is not particularly persistent, and that's going to be consistent with sort of what we see in the time series of the treatment effect. Then the second part is conditional on having those two parameters, plus this distribution, this assumption I'm making on how firms learn, that's going to spit back what the intensive margin is. So roughly what this is saying is that on an average draw from who you learn from is about 5% worse than sort of like the average firm in the economy. So it's a little below 0 if you want. Okay? All right, so given all that, I can just run the RCT in the model. That's not too hard. I basically just replicate everything from the experiment inside the model and ask what the time series of the treatment effect looks like, and it's that solid blue line right there. So if anything, we're overestimating the speed of the fade out relative to the data, despite the fact that we are building a model that is specifically designed to try and maximize the spillovers that are here. And in fact, I'm happy to talk about this afterwards, but this is in large part, the reason we're missing this, the reason we're estimating such a quick fade out is in part because we're estimating that diffusion is a very important thing at scale. So those two parameters are closely linked to each other. All right, so do I have like 2 minutes? 6, my gosh, talking too fast. So let me just tell you a little bit about how the model works. So what we're going to think about here is I'm going to run an aggregate experiment where I permanently increase this parameter theta by 25%. So 25% is not a particularly interpretable thing here, but think about this as like there's some distortion that stops firms from learning or directing their search towards the best people, and we're just going to make it easier for firms to do that. If you focus on, so I'll say the first thing to note is that causes average income or aggregate income, because there's a measurement of people, to go up by 11%. And that's the first row of column 2 here. That's a function of two forces that are operating in the model, actually a lot like the forces Diego was highlighting. The first is that, well, if you make it easier to learn, the idea economy, or the idea distribution in the economy is going to shift. Right, so more people are learning from smarter people. That's going to have an equilibrium implication of sort of shifting up the idea distribution. That's the first effect, which is right there, which is about 2/3 of the total. But then there's a second effect. If the average firm gets more productive, if the average person gets more productive, that's going to cause the wage to rise. But what happens when the wage rises? The marginal guys who are just deciding to operate a firm are going to drop out. But those people are also firms that other people were learning from. And so now if we kick them out, it actually makes it even easier for everyone to learn because we've got rid of some of the crappier firms in the economy. So that's going to further push this distribution up by changing that. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. And so we're going to get to the new steady state, which is both a combination of sort of this direct effect of changing learning, but also the competitive pressures that drive wages are also going to have a quantitatively important effect here. Okay, so that's how the model works, and now sort of here's sort of the link back to the RCTs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a bunch of betas and rhos. I estimated those things. They control the direct effect, but now I'm just going to start varying them. And then at the same time, I'm also going to vary this parameter theta to make sure I hit the same treatment effect. That's on your left, so the one closest to me. That's showing you the implied theta for each combination of beta and rho that guarantees that we hit the exact same treatment effect. Then on the right panel are the aggregate gains that result from the same experiment. So scaling the intervention, increasing rho, or increasing theta, increasing the extensive margin. And you can see how large these things, how much they vary, right? So if you look at sort of the bottom corner, so low beta, low rho, that's saying that it's very hard to learn from other people. As you might expect, you make it easier to find good people, but if you can't learn from them, none of it matters anyways. It jumps all the way up to 38%. So this is what, 75-ish fold difference between the smallest and largest. And these are all economies that generate the exact same average treatment effect and only differ in the relative importance of the direct effect relative to the extensive margin. So the quantitative costs here can be quite large. We can rerun this exercise in just changing the average treatment effect you want to hit. So I just showed you what happens for the average treatment effect of whatever that first period one was, which was 40% or so. This is the band of possible aggregate outcomes that you can achieve for a given average treatment effect. And what you can see is that any combination of these things is possible. Oh, look at that, thanks. This is my last slide, but for future presenters. Thank you. So this is our implied aggregate gain. So this is our 11% that we pull out of the model. And so the point I showed you just a minute ago is right about here. But you can see that, if I want to try and draw a relationship between the average treatment effect and the aggregate gains, it could be positive, it could be negative, it could be unrelated to each other. And so there's basically very little information that you can pull out for a policy-relevant aggregate implications from just the average treatment effect. Instead, what you really need to be using is both a combination of this average treatment effect and some measure of covariance that's better linked to the aggregate forces in the model. So let me conclude. This paper is sort of a study of the relationship between reduced form RCT results and at-scale gains from learning. We take a bit of a different approach than Diego. One approach is to run more and more complicated RCTs. We think that's important. But also, if we're inferring implications from partial equilibrium RCTs that have already been run, we'd hate to just throw them away, right? Part of what we're trying to say is that there's actual information about scalable policy contained in those experiments, and we should be using those in conjunction with the forces that Diego were talking about. I'll just mention we leave open a number of issues, so this is not sort of hopefully not the last step in any of this, but maybe a decent first step. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. Excellent timing. Now the discussant is Jonas Hyperts, who is joining online.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Let me just put up the slides. Can you see the slides? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this super interesting and exciting paper. I very much enjoyed it. And I hope that some of the knowledge diffused to me through reading the paper. The main question, as Kevin already explained it, was is that a growing body of micro evidence in developing countries shows that frictions to knowledge diffusion have an important effect on economic aggregate outcomes. And so many papers in this literature use matching interventions at the micro scale that improve the likelihood of firms to meet a firm that it can learn from. So this paper does two things. I think the most important one is to really get out a caution that the standard empirical moments that you generally use to define a successful experiment or policy can be very misleading if you think about scaling that policy up to the national level or to the country level. Instead, there's a covariance moment, an adjusted covariance moment that predicts for a very large class of models much better the aggregate effects that you can get from this. So I think the paper is already at a very advanced stage. So in this discussion, I will rather kind of offer another way to present what the authors did and find. And I will conclude with some thoughts and questions that I had while reading the paper. So if you consider a set of economies that differ in terms of their in terms of the diffusion parameters theta and beta, and then I've also highlighted that all of these economies obviously also differ in terms of their remaining structure, which I think is important to interpret the aggregate gains that the authors find for the Kenyan case. So this diffusion block of the model is basically this law of motion for ability, where tomorrow's ability is a function of today's ability, and the way how firms learn from a firm that they meet. So there's at the center of this diffusion block, there's also the distribution of imitation opportunities, and this distribution depends on theta, which basically measures how likely it is.
Excuse me, Jonas. Actually, if I may interrupt, we are not seeing your slides. So I think the IT team needs to project the zoom on the screen. Yes.
Okay.
No, but we need to see the zoom. Ouais. Now we have the slides. Yes. Now, thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry. So just to recap, think about these different economies, a set of economies that differ in terms of the diffusion parameter, and now what is ultimately of interest is what happens if you introduce an at-scale policy that improves the matching the matching capacity of firms in that economy. So there's an aggregate gain that you can think of here, this delta y, that depends on the initial parameters, theta I and beta I. You also, for this economy, you also have a matching intervention that delivers you an average treatment effect and an adjusted covariance moment using two linear regressions. So now the question is, how does aggregate gains depend on these diffusion parameters? And what you can see is that actually this beta coefficient that basically determines how effective a match is in terms of increasing the ability of a firm has a much bigger impact on aggregate gains than the theta parameter, which just increases the likelihood of meeting a firm that has a higher ability than the initial firm. And what is also very interesting, I thought, is that basically for very small betas, even if you increase theta here, you don't have a very big effect on aggregate outcomes. The other important mapping that the very important mapping at the heart of the paper, I think, that the authors find is that if you have the average treatment effect of an intervention and this adjusted covariance moment, you can back out those two parameters, and then you can actually obtain a lot of important information on how this intervention would play out at the aggregate scale, because in particular you get the value of beta I. So then the authors apply this method at using data from a randomized control trial of a previous paper, and what they do is to tailor the rest of the economy to the Kenyan case, and to measure and quantify the effect of an at-scale policy at 11%. So as Kevin already discussed, this effect comes from two sources. There's this first effect that the new matching technology directly improves the ability distribution. And there's the second effect that comes from basically general equilibrium effects on the wage and the exit of firms that are less productive, and basically that kind of reinforces the learning ability of firms in the economy. And very importantly, through counterfactual simulations, the author then show again that if you can get the exact same average treatment effect for varying combinations of diffusion parameters, but for these different combinations of diffusion parameters, you find vastly different aggregate gains in terms of at-scale policy. So this is kind of a very quick recap of the paper, and when I read the paper, there were several thoughts I had, which relate to the rest of the model. In fact, so how important is basically the economic structure that you impose on the rest of the model, especially, for example, in the case of the Kenyan, in the model that is tailored to the Kenyan case, you have some assumptions on suppliers that they have access to inelastic supply of inputs. How would this? So I wonder what happens if you would relax these assumptions, and if that would have a big effect on the aggregate gains. Then the paper suggests that the beta coefficient drives aggregate gains much more than the theta parameter. And is there something that we can learn from there for policy? Should we try to actually increase rather beta or instead of theta? And if that's the case, how could policies look like that would kind of target this ability of firms to really profit from a match? Another kind of field of questions was related to how well can we actually go from diffusion parameters estimated in experiments to those that play a role at scale policies. So what I have in mind is that if firms know that when they share some knowledge at a local or micro scale, basically they know that this won't have any big effect on aggregate or on general equilibrium. But as soon as they do know it, wouldn't they become more reluctant to share knowledge? And this relates to another point, which you mentioned in the paper, that there is also incentives of sharing knowledge or not sharing knowledge, and how does this interact with the estimation is another question. Yeah, so these are the three main points that came to my mind reading the paper. So just to conclude quickly, so I think it's a very, very important paper. I learned, I think, a lot from it. And I also think it's extremely relevant for policymakers that want to implement at-scale policy to improve knowledge diffusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonas. So Kevin, you want to respond?
Yeah, great. Oops, there we go. Yeah, thanks, Jonas. One of the benefits of having a great discussion, especially in a short talk, is a discussant who fills in a lot of the interesting questions that I didn't get a chance to talk about, or that we can't talk about, quite frankly, in this paper. So that was really terrific. Let me just briefly try and respond to these 3 points. Just overall, my question is going to, or my answer is going to be, yeah, that's a great point. We don't know. So on the first one, how important is the rest of the model? The answer is very. You know, how you build the rest of the structure is going to affect the spillovers that get created. The occupational choice decisions are going to have implications for how far from the efficient allocation we are in the economy. And we've been pushing a little bit on trying to figure out how we could sort of think about those things with less structure. And I think the answer is you can't. So the way we're trying to pitch this a little bit is to say, well, you know, the effects the way you can identify these diffusion parameters is relatively broad, and we don't really have a theory of what the rest of the economy is in each specific application. And instead, we would leave that to, you know, whatever the details of the specific economy that you're operating are in. But I think that's a really important point to highlight. Let me skip to point 3, which is, are firms not going to share knowledge if they know they're interacting at scale and there are these potential spillovers? It's a great question. So I should say, I think we can do some very simple versions of this in the model. We can think about like bargaining over the surplus that a match creates. That's not so hard. And I think the thing I want to highlight in response to this is that it's very easy to write down the model where you can build in costs of sharing at scale. But then the question is like more parameters require more moments. And so I think that's sort of the big thing. If you want to add that flavor to the model, that's great. It's just going to require a little bit more subtlety and a little bit more sort of theory-driven experimentation to get those parameters in addition to the ones we already have. So I think that is like maybe that's the biggest question, at least I won't speak for my co-authors, but that I've walked away from this paper with is trying to see how much farther you can push this. Your last point, should we try and increase beta? I think the answer is yes, but I don't know what that looks like, unfortunately. So I'd be curious if you have thoughts about that. Yeah. And thanks again.
So
Thank you so much.
Questions from the floor? There.
Thanks for a great talk, Kevin. Every time I see it, I understand a little bit more. So right now you are estimating off of these covariance moments, and then you're like showing how the model matches a time series. Now, I was wondering if you could also estimate it matching the time series of the like ATE. So is it identified, and if so, like how different are the rho and the beta that you would back out from that? Thanks.
Hi, very nice paper. I just had a question about the fade out of the treatment effects in the RCT. Would the model predict that that's because somehow the control group is starting to catch up? And if so, like even just showing the raw time series for both treatment and control, would that tell you, is there a prediction on whether it's the treatment group that loses the advantage or the control group that catches up, and whether you can see that in the time series?
Thank you. So I feel I still only understand 20% of the paper, but let me still try to launch a desperate defense of the average treatment effect. So the average treatment effect also has the nice property that if you observe only a noisy version of the outcome variable that you care about, you can still identify that treatment effect consistently. So is that still the case? I mean, if you observe only a noisy version of the outcome variable, or let's say there's not a one-to-one mapping between the Z and the profit, for example, can you still, is this correction term still useful?
So you can answer this round of questions. And
Great. Yeah, thanks. These are all great questions. So to Alessandro's question, yeah, if we estimate off the time series instead of just the one period, it's still identified. And actually, this is going to be closely connected to Johannes's question as well. It's still identified, and given sort of how well we met, the model predicts a particular shape, as you might expect, which is sort of like this exponential fade out. You can be more complicated and get other shapes, but given how closely we match sort of like how fast the fade out happens, which is 3/4, the results that come out of it are nearly identical. And it is all identified. You can build in fixed effects, you can build in time effects, etc. Vittorio, to your point, yeah, so that's exactly right. So what the model's sort of saying is that, you know, the larger this beta term is, two things. We're working in a world with random meetings, right? It's distorted sort of relative to the equilibrium distribution, but the larger beta is, the sort of more likely you are to get bumped up into the tail for a given match, right? And so you can imagine if you run this experiment in partial equilibrium long enough, then everyone's gonna bump into someone. And so beta, the higher beta is, which again means the larger the aggregate diffusion gains are gonna be, the faster the fade out is gonna be. Now, to your point, we look at that, and then the question sort of becomes like, it sort of depends what you believe the aggregate state of the economy is, right? So if you think that there are shocks happening and maybe the control group is trending in a particular direction, then you're left sort of just looking at the average treatment effect I showed you. So you do see the catch up, but you also see like very strange patterns in the control firm profit data. So I'm not entirely sure sort of whether I should push sort of the levels as opposed to the difference, but I certainly take that point. Yeah, to Johannes, yeah, so that's a great question. Yes, we can deal with noise, and the same procedure goes through. The math is exceptionally more complicated. There's a giant fixed point problem that you need to solve. And the key assumption that you have to make to get our same results to go through, so number one, you have to do it non-parametrically. But the key assumption we have to make is that you need two measures of the outcome. So I need to be able to measure profit in two ways, which is kind of nice if you are working in a context with RCTs, because I can ask people about profit and then I can measure revenue minus costs, and then you can use that to estimate the distribution of the errors, of the noise in the model, then you have to go into like polar coordinates and all that kind of stuff, and it's not fun. So it's feasible to do. The data requirements, like just the power you need, are a lot more intense, but the theory sort of goes through basically unchanged with that, with having two measures of profit.
we still have time for one or two questions. Yeah. So
I think I understand oh, thank you. Yeah, the logic of the exercise, but in a way here you have gone all the way to sort of commit to a model and then tell me, oh, look, if I commit to this model, then the average treatment effect is not really very informative. But when I think about your model, I think of it as a recipe. And there's some ingredients on which you have no clue maybe what would be the alternative model, but some instead where you can shed a little bit more light. So I was wondering whether you can comment on which other things would you like to know. So it seems like the matching function, for instance, you could ask the question in your model, how sensitive, how important is this indeterminacy relative to the variation that I would get in the results if I were to change a little bit the matching function. And the matching function is something we can learn about. In your model, you say, if the average quality of the entrepreneurs increases because of competition, wages is higher, and so forth, or through the standard occupational choice model, people still get a match. They just get a match with someone who is on average better. But again, that's something that you can give me some sensitivity there, and so on.
So I have a related comment, because if you think of average treatment effect as a moment to identify your model, then it's, your model is under-identified, right? Because you have the beta and the theta. But then, if you, as you said, commit to the model, why don't you just use other moments? Why do you even need an RCT?
Yeah, so these are, again, both great questions. So Rocco, this sort of gets back to Jonas's first point too, which is sort of like, what's the quantitative importance of the rest of the model? So let me say, first of all, in some sense, it has to be the case that, as a general statement, the matching function is the thing that matters most, right? In the set of all possible matching functions. Within the context of random matching, then it turns out not to matter very much. But that's, we could talk about this more over beers or something, but like, the random matching functions sort of are designed to push a lot of people around and to push knowledge around very quickly. So if you start getting into things, actually, this is very similar to, I'm going to forget all the authors, but this recent paper about random seeding in network RCTs. It has that very same flavor where it's like the information moves very quickly in these models. And so conditional on living in that world, sort of how you build in those details, it's not so critical. But there are certainly other matching functions where maybe people in some part of the distribution can't see other people in other parts of the distribution where those become more important. And I totally agree. That to me seems like the obvious next step of like, where should we keep pushing? Where do we need more variation to build into this? The other thing I'll mention, independent of that really matters, is the variation of the random innovations in productivity. Right, so you can imagine if that variance is very large, then you're going to get some people who just randomly become very smart, and then everyone's going to go learn from them. So that turns out to be a very important moment, sort of like what the rest of the noise in the model looks like and that type of thing. So those are sort of the two key things. But I completely agree. I think the next step for us is thinking about how to think about the matching function in this context and sort of thinking about, taking a step back and viewing the matching function not just from the RCT perspective, but what that tells us sort of moving forward in the aggregates. Yeah, and so to your point, I mean, on some level, that's the whole point, right? It's that if you take a model that we sort of think is reasonable, there are all of these various forces floating around, and then the average treatment effect is just one of them, and whether that's related to the thing we actually care about or not is a statement that has to come through the rest of the model. And so, yeah, it could have been the case that all of these moments sort of move together. It could have been the case that the average treatment effect sort of moves with the aggregates. But I think part of what we're finding is that there are these forces that move in the exact opposite direction that require some more information. But that's sort of like, that's exactly how we started on this, that it's one moment in sort of a broader view of the world. Yeah, I agree completely.
Thank you both. Thanks everybody for the discussion. Now we're moving to the next paper. So, by Jae-do Choi.
Yep, should start? Right, thanks for organizer for accepting my paper. And user disclaimer applies. The result of this presentation is my own. It does not reflect the view of the Federal Reserve System. So this paper that I'm going to present today is titled Technology Adoption and Late Industrialization, which is joint work with Yang Shim with a PhD student at the University of Chicago. So in the post-war period, there have been divergent patterns of industrialization across many developing countries. Some developing countries, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Brazil, successfully transferred the economic base to manufacturing, while many other developing countries remain stagnant. So these developing countries achieved their industrialization through the adoption of advanced foreign technologies rather than their own innovation. So this adoption-driven industrialization is known as late industrialization and was considered to be different from the earlier process of industrialization in the Western economies. So many policymakers and economists have believed that the adoption of foreign advanced technologies can make developing countries richer. So newly adopted technology can improve performance or productivity of firms that directly adopt technology, but also if knowledge from newly adopted technology can be diffused locally, it's possible that this adoption to have local productivity spillover effects. When this kind of spillover effect exists, the adoption can be even more powerful driving force for economic development. However, despite the widely held belief on the importance of technology adoption, there's little very empirically quantitatively known about the impact of technology adoption in this developing economic setting. One of the key challenges comes from the measurement and data availability. It's known to be very difficult to measure amounts of technology adoption, especially in these developing countries. So the question I'm going to address in this paper is going to be how the technology adoption and local spillover contribute to late industrialization. So to answer this question, I studied South Korea in the 1970s because South Korea was one of the developing countries that experienced very rapid industrialization. And also during the 1970s, it provided temporary adoption subsidies for the heavy manufacturing sector firms. So as long as there's some policy externality of adoption activities, it's possible that this kind of subsidies or like policy to be welfare improving. So South Korea gives a unique opportunity to evaluate the effectiveness of such policy. So in this paper, we constructed, hand-collected, and digitized unique novel data set that covers the universe of firm-level technology adoption contract between South Korean and foreign firms. And this is going to be matched with the balance sheet variable and the very detailed geographic location. So one of the key advantages of this data set is that using this data set, we can measure firm-level technology adoption at a very detailed micro level. So this is one of the example of the actual contract made between the Japanese and Korean firms. And most of the adopted technology during this time were know-how. When I say know-how, it's about the transfer of blueprints or training service provided by the foreign firms. So for example, as a part of the contract, Japanese firm had to provide a transfer blueprint to Korean firms. Second, they also had to provide training service to Korean engineers by sending its own workers to Korea. Finally, they also had to provide unique opportunities for Korean engineers to make them visit their Japanese factory and let them see how they were actually operating those factories or machineries. So when I say technology, it's mostly about the know-how transfer. So using this novel data set, we provide 3 empirical novel evidence on technology adoption. The first is direct gains to adopting firms. So to deal with some selection issues, we're comparing adopting firms to non-adopting firms that try to adopt technology but failed in the end due to some exogenous reason, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail later. Our empirical estimate implies that once firms adopt technology, their sales or revenue TFP increase by 45 to 50%. And also we provide local productive spillover effect. And to do so, we use spatial variation at the very geographic detail, fine-level geographic details. And our empirical estimate implies that one standard deviation of the spillover measure increase was associated with non-adopter sales or revenue TFP by about 12 to 15%. Finally, we also provide complementarity, evidence on complementarity in firms' adoption decision, which means that if more firms around me adopt the technology, I'll be more likely to adopt technology. So we use the same variation with local productive spillover. And our empirical estimate implies that one standard deviation of the spillover measure increase was associated with the increasing probability of making a new adoption contract by 1.5 percentage points. So based on this empirical evidence, we build a stylized dynamic spatial model with firms' endogenous technology adoption decision and local productivity spillovers, which is this block of the model comes from my first and second empirical findings. And spillover operates with a one-time lag, so it introduces dynamics in the model. So in my model setting, spillover can generate dynamic complementarity in firms' adoption decisions. So if more firms adopt technology yesterday, then I'll be more likely to adopt technology today. And when this dynamic complementarity is strong enough, the model potentially features multiple steady state. So in one steady state, only a few firms of technology, and therefore economy has low productivity. But in the other steady state, because all the firms adopt technology, and therefore economy has higher productivity steady state, and this one predominates the other one. So when this kind of multiple steady state exists, it's possible that one-time very temporary subsidy to the adoption can have very persistent effect to the economy, because it can move the economy from a bad steady state to a higher or better steady state. So using this model, we answer the following counterfactual question. So what if the South Korean government had not provided temporary adoption subsidy to the heavy manufacturing sectors? So this model is going to be calibrated to the microdata and the econometric estimate. So our quantitative result shows that Korean economy could have converted to an alternative, less industrialized steady state, where the heavy manufacturing sector GDP share is about 15 percentage points permanently lower, and heavy manufacturing sector export share would be about 20 percentage point lower. Especially this drop of the 15 percentage point here is equivalent to moving the 2000 Korean level, 2010 Mexico level. So the model, when calibrated to microdata econometric estimate, can potentially generate multiple steady state big push theory. So let me go to the data. So my final data set is the firm level unbalanced panel data with 3 key information. The first is adoption dummy variable, whether Korean firms made a contract with foreign firms. The second is balance variable, which includes sales, employment assets, and fixed assets. And also we have detailed information on firms' location and production. The sample period covers between 1970 to 1982. There are 10 manufacturing sectors, and 4 of them will be classified as the heavy manufacturing sector. In terms of the coverage of data set, our data on the adoption activities covers the universe of firm-level adoption activity in South Korea during that time, and also balance sheet variables, also pretty represented at the national level. So in terms of technology adoption, most of the technology adoption with know-how, about 74%, and there were about 1,700 contracts and made by 700 unique firms, and most of the adoption happened in heavy manufacturing sector. About 80% of the total contract were made in the heavy manufacturing sector, and we obtained this information by digitizing the document that were submitted to the government authorities when Korean firms were making a new contract with foreign firms. And we also digitized firms' balance sheet variable and geography information. One thing to note is that this is one of the first firm-level panel data studies during the South Korea's very rapid industrialization periods. So before going to the empirical analysis, let me explain some historical background on South Korea's industrialization pattern. So this is South Korea's heavy manufacturing GDP shares between 1970 to 1982 during the sample period, and increased from 6 to 14%. To give you just idea how rapid this transformation was, in the early 1970s, it's about like 6%, which was about Greece level. In the early 1970s, it reached Mexico level about 10%. In the early 1980s, it became 14%, which is above the United States level. And our novel micro data set reveals that these rapid changes in heavy manufacturing GDP shares were accompanied by this increases in number of new adoption contracts made by Korean heavy manufacturing sector firms. So this is in each year, this is the number of the newly adopted technology by Korean firms each year. During the sample period, the total number of new contracts was more than quadrupled. So this rapid increases in heavy manufacturing GDP share in the adoption activities in the mid-1970s were not a coincidence, but it was rather a deliberate outcome of the government policy, which started to promote these adoption activities by providing temporary subsidies to the Korean firms when they make adoption contract. So let me briefly explain some about the background of this policy. So this is called HCI Drive, and they target heavy manufacturing sectors, including chemicals, electronics, machineries, non-ferrous metal, shipbuilding, and steel. And one of the main policy instruments was the subsidy for technology adoption. The Korean government subsidized for example, purchases of capital equipment that are related to the newly adopted technologies. And one of the reasons they really focused on the adoption activities were because given that they're very far from the frontier, they viewed that one of the most effective ways to catching up was the adoption rather than their own innovation. And this is also temporary policy because this very sectoral specific subsidies were ended because the president was assassinated in 1979. So this is going to be the policy that I'm going to evaluate using the model. So before going to the model, let me talk about some 3 firm-level effects of technology adoption. First, direct effect. So when we try to understand the direct impact of firm technology adoption activities, one of the key econometric challenges is that firms are making endogenous adoption decisions, leading to the standard selection bias problem. So typical ideal empirical scenario to study this kind of impact of adoption would be some random assignment or coin toss would be the ideal setting. However, this kind of setting is impossible in the observation of data. So to approximate such an ideal empirical scenario, we're using the winners versus loser research design. So winners are going to be defined as traded firms, and these are going to be the adopting firms. But losers are the control group, which is defined as a non-adopter that tried to adopt technology but failed in the end because of foreign firms' seemingly exogenous cancellations. So we could use 2 definitions for defining losers. The first is that these losers actually made a contract, and this contract were approved by the government. However, even after the contract, this contract were not actually implemented because foreign firms canceled this contract. So for example, examples of the cancellation include changes to foreign firms' management team or foreign firms' bankruptcy. So Korean firms at the time, also when they experience this kind of cancellation, they also have to report related document to the Korean authorities. So by reading this kind of document, we kind of pick this kind of cancellation that seems to be seemingly exogenous. For example, the domestic firms running out of cash flow, we kind of rule out those kind of scenarios. We only pick the cancellation based on the foreign firms' cancellations. So based on this procedure, we kind of have very small set of losers, 34 pairs. And for each loser, we are going to match a winner based by first exactly matching on region and sector to observe about anything shock that are common at the region sector level. And also we are going to then distance match based on the firms observable to compare losers and winners with a similar firm size. We are going to using log assets. So for this kind of, so basically our identifying assumption for this kind of research design is that a loser forms a valid counterfactual from a winner. To do so, we have to satisfy the following 2 conditions. That first, the cancellation should be exogenous to domestic Korean firms. And second, a winners and losers should be ex ante similar in terms of both observables and the unobservables. The first is something we using the document to identify, and the second, we can check the balance, and then we find the winners and losers very ex ante similar, but also using the firm-to-firm structure, we also show that foreign firm, they will match it with the losers and winners or ex ante similar. And unobservable, in terms of unobservable, we are using the information that both of winners and losers tried the technology. So in using this procedure, we are going to indirectly infer that they're all similar in terms of the unobservables. So based on this 34 matched pair, we are going to run the following event study specification, where the dependent variable is going to be y for firm I, pair P, time t. So we are going to control this event time dummies here, and we are going to, this is the coefficient of our interest, which measures the difference between losers and winners, and this is going to be identified the interaction term between the event time dummies and firm's actual adoption status, and we control firm, pair, time, fixed effect. So for dependent variable, we are going to use log sales and revenue TFP, and sample is going to be matches 34 pairs, so there are about 68 firms in this sample, which is quite small. And the main identifying variation is going to be the differences within pairs at event time t. So we are going to identify this parameter by comparing the trajectory of the winners and losers. We are going to 2A cluster at both firm and pair level. So this is one of the main regression result, and this is the year since adoption. So this contract happened, and the cancellation also happened. Before this cancellation, these winners and losers are ex ante similar. So each coefficient kind of captures how losers and winners differences. And what this means is that they were ex ante similar in terms of log sales before the contract actually happened. But winners is their sales start to be increasing only after they actually made a contract. We also find a similar result for the revenue TFP matrix as well. And given that this is a very small set of sample, we also conduct using the event size specification that uses a full sample data, but in terms of magnitude it's different, but we also find somewhat very large impact of technology adoption activities as well. So this is the first, that was our direct impact of technology adoption. Now let me talk about local product spillover. And we don't have particular mechanism behind spillover, but historical cases shows that there was knowledge diffusion was pretty widely happened in Korea, as Kevin emphasized in personal technology diffusion. But also there was a wide mobility of engineers across different firms within local area. So these kind of two channels can be potentially potential channels for the local productivity spillover. So we are going to define the spillover measure as the follows. For firm I in region N, sector J, and time T, lagged by H, we lagged by 4 years. And the spillover measure for firm I is going to be defined as the weighted average of firms' adoption status, where the weight is given by the inverse between these two firms. And we also did some robustness. I think Diego also has a very similar measure. But for now, I'm using the only sigma to be 1. If you come up with some better sigma, I'll cite the paper and do more robustness check using the estimated sigma. And so basically what is important about this measure is that because each firm has different weights, this measure varies across firms within the same region and sector J. And using the spillover measure, I'm going to run the following regression model using the overlapping long difference model. And this dependent variable is going to be either log sales or revenue TAP changes. And we are going to control, this is going to be our main spillover independent variable. And importantly, we're going to control region sector time fixed effect, which means that we're only identifying the spillover regression estimate using the variation of the spillover measure within the same region and sector J. We also control some other controls. And for the baseline estimate, you estimate this model only for the never adopted samples. We cluster at the region and conglomerate levels. So spillover regression has many econometric challenges, as everybody knows here. One of the key challenges is kind of spatially correlated shock, which leads to the superior correlation. So to deal with the problem, I exploit granular fixed effect for the spatial unit analysis. The median size of my spatial unit analysis is about the Manhattan size in the United States, which is about the 34 square miles or 90 kilometers per mile. And which means that because we are controlling this set of granular fixed effect, we are only using the variation in distances to adopting firms of the same sector within narrowly defined regions. There can be some other potential effect of being close to big size firms, which will lead to the omitted variable bias. We control the following weighted average of firm sales to isolate the variation from being close to adopters from being close to just big size firms. We also control this market size measure because firms can grow faster if they're close to other big size firms because they can sell it to the big size firms. To control this one, we're constructing the market size measure at the local level using firm sales and the distance and the input-output coefficient. So for this spillover estimate to have some causal interpretation, the distance to adopters should be uncorrelated with non-adopter unobservables, conditional fixed effect, and the also other controls. So this is our estimation result. Across different specifications with different set of control, this is a weighted average of sales. This is market size measure, and this is Korea's famous for big size chaebol, like conglomerate fixed effect. And despite controlling different controls here, we find positive, stable coefficient result across different specifications. In terms of the magnitude, it implies that one standard deviation increase of spillover measure was associated increase in firm sales increased by 15%. We find also similar magnitude for the revenue TAP as well. So we also provide empirical evidence of complementarity firms' adoption decisions. So if more firms adopt technology around me, I'll be more likely to adopt technology today. So we run exactly the same specification, but here now using the full sample. And the dependent variable is instead of changing log sales, we're using the whether firms made a new contract in that year. So we are going to run exactly the same specification. And we also find very highly positive and stable and coefficient result for this complementarity evidence. So interpretation is that one standard deviation increase on the spillover measure associated probability of making a new adoption contract by 1.5 percentage point. And when considering that, average share of adopting a new technology in each year Korea at the time was about 3%. So this 1.5 percentage points increase is pretty sizable. Okay, these are my three firm level effect of technology adoption. So based on this empirical evidence, I'm going to build a very stylized dynamic model a simple dynamic space model and trying to evaluate the South Korea's policy. So to give you an idea, I'm going to explain I'm going to simplify the model and try to give you intuition. The setup is very straightforward. For now, I'm going to only consider closed economy with only one region and time, discrete time, indexed by T. There's only one region and one sector for now. And firms are monopoly competitive, indexed by I, and we fix firms' entry. So firms' total mass is going to be normalized to be 1. And firms are heterogeneous only along productivity, which is denoted as ZIT. And households provide a labor supply inelastically, and their income comes from wages and profits from the firms. How many times do I have? 9, okay, that's good. So firms decision, all the agent decision in this model is very simple and static. So firms make static adoption decision. So if firms adopt technology, they can enjoy direct profit gain today, but also they have to pay fixed adoption cost, which is in units of final goods. I'm going to talk about the importance of adoption later, and also households make a static consumption decision each period. So despite all the agents in this economy make static adoption decision and static consumption decision, the model potentially features dynamics. The dynamic comes from the spillover. The spillover operates with one-time lag that is consistent with my spillover regression model. And I'm going to treat it as externality. So firms take this externality as given each period, which is determined in the previous period. So the spillover is going to be like a link between the periods. So firm's productivity is going to be composed of the 3 parts. The first is direct product gain. So if firms adopt technologies, this TIT is equal to 1, and firms can enjoy productive gain parameterized by eta, which is larger than 1. And the second component is spillover part. So this is a function of the shares of adopter in the previous period, which is increasing function of this share. So if more firms adopt technology previously, today overall firms' productivity goes up. The final component is firm's exogenous productivity, which is assumed to follow the Pareto distribution. Yeah, so I'm going to give the particular functional form from the spillover. So this is a spillover functional form, and the strength of spillover is going to be governed by this parameter delta. It has an interpretation with semi-elasticity. So if I take the log of the adopting firm's sales, what I can show is that this parameter eta here can be mapped to my winners versus losers estimate in the first empirical fact, direct gains from the adopting firms. And what I also can do is that if I take log of non-adopting firm sales, I can drive the similar regression model that were used for my second empirical fact. But one key difference here is that in the model, there's no really differences in distances within region. But for empirical analysis, I used variation in distances. To make the model to be consistent with empirical my finding, I'm going to assume that in this region, all the firms are equally distanced. So under that interpretation, I can connect this delta to my spillover estimate in the second fact. So firms adopt technology only when there are gains from adoption, which is defined as differences between the profit of the adoption and profit of non-adoption minus fixed adoption cost. So this is the expression for firms' gains from adoption under the monopoly competition. And this measures direct gains, and this component is spillover, and this point is the fixed adoption cost. And under firms' heterogeneity, this adoption decision will be characterized by firms' productivity cutoff, which is defined as like this. And under the Pareto distribution, I can show that lambda t can be a function of the cutoff, and also it will be a function of the Pareto shape parameter theta. And this is going to be bounded by 1 because of this probability interpretation. And what I can show is that, I'm going to define lambda t star as Schroeder equilibrium shares of adopting firms. So because of the dynamic complementarity, lambda t star increases lambda t minus 1. So where the source of dynamic complementarity comes from, this comes from an assumption that fixed adoption costs are in units of final goods. So if more firms adopt technology today's overall productivity goes up through the spillover, so the overall fixed adoption cost gets lower today. This force generates dynamic complementarity that's consistent with my empirical finding. So lambda t star increases in previous shares of adopters, and what I also can show is that under some technical assumption, there exists a unique Schroeder equilibrium for each t. So which means that given the initial value, there always exists a unique path to a steady state. Okay, so given this initial value, there exists unique path to the steady state, but depending on the values of initial value, the path might convert to a different steady state if multiple steady states exist. Let me show you this graphically. So this is Scholler equilibrium curve, and this curve is each dot here represent equilibrium value today given this previous year's adopter. So given this value, previous year's adopter, today's equilibrium is going to define it here. And this curve is increasing because of the dynamic complementary forces. And this is here is going to be bounded by 1 because of my assumption that firm's total mass is normalized to be 1. And so this lambda t is going to be interpreted as probability. So steady state condition implies that lambda should be time invariant. So as long as this Scholler equilibrium curve can intersect at the multiple location, the model potentially features multiple steady state. So for example, in this setup, there exists a 3 steady state. The good industrialized steady state where all the firms adopt technology. And this one is what I call pre-industrialized steady state when only a few firms adopt technology. And this one is like unstable one, which is out of our focus. And this one, because this steady state has higher productivity, this one Pareto dominates the pre-industrialized steady state. And the importance under this setup, because of my static decision assumption, initial condition, history determines which steady state to be realized. Suppose initial conditions given in this range, economy convert a pre-industrial steady state, but if the initial conditions given in this range, economy convert a better or Pareto dominating industrialized steady state. So what is important generating this non-linearity of the Scholler equilibrium curve is this spillover force. So because of the spillover force, this Scholler equilibrium curve is nonlinear and meets with this steady state line with 3 times. For example, if I assume no spillover, which is going to be the case where delta is 0, the economy is always going to be characterized by this horizontal line where there is always unique steady state. So when this delta is large enough, it makes this curve nonlinear and therefore potentially generate multiple steady state here.
So, Jido, you have 3 minutes.
Yeah, that's good. So when this kind of multiple states exist, suppose initial conditions given in this range, which is known as poverty trap in the growth or development literature, this economy has converted to bad steady state, even though it has potential to go to a higher productivity steady state. So how temporary policy can work? If the temporary subsidy can move on the economy, so a new transition path to convert to a Pareto-dominated steady state, in such case, it's possible that one-time subsidy to have permanent effect to the economy. So I'm going to extend this very simple model to the multiple region and multiple sector. I'm not going to talk too much about today, but export in Korea, make a very quantitative important decision because of the complementarity between market size and firms adoption decision. There are multiple regions, multiple sectors, and technology adoption is only a variable heavy manufacturing sectors. And there are costly trade across regions, across different countries. Now firms make not only adoption decision, but also export decision. I'm going to have roundabout production, which also generate the stronger force for this impact of policy. I'm going to also incorporate household costly migration decision. One of the reasons I can incorporate this decision is that because it also quantitatively play a large role, but also in the literature, it has been well known that this mobility between rural to urban area is going to be very high during the industrialization period. Finally, I'm going to model subsidies as input subsidy for adopting firms financed by labor tax. So the government's budget is always balanced. So I'm not going to talk about the calibration procedure, but I'm only going to talk about subsidy rate. So models calibrate to the cross-sectional data in 1970 to 1976, 1980, and subsidy rate is only going to be provided for 1976 and 1980. I'm going to propose the identifying moment for this subsidy. The intuition is that using my reduced empirical analysis, I measure benefit. So increases the amounts adopted during the policy period, I can invert the model and trying to get some information about the subsidy level. My calibrated value shows that it's about 11%. I'm going to fit the other parameters, geographic fundamentals, using the massive moment. Okay, this is my main quantitative result, and this is the time period. And only during the gray period, subsidies are provided. And this green line here is the data, and this is the heavy manufacturing GDP share. And because I fit the models exactly to the data, in the baseline here, subsidy, the model exactly fit the data. But here, I'm not going to fit this model to data, so this can be considered as a non-targeted moment. In the counterfactual, I'm not going to provide subsidy, and under the counterfactual, the Korea's GDP share of the heavy manufacturing remains low. And I find similar patterns for the export. So if there was no subsidized technology adoption, Korea's comparative advantage could have been very different. Okay, to summarize, we digitize new data. We provide some new empirical evidence on adoption, especially direct gain, spillover, and complementarity. And quantitatively, we find that subsidized technology adoption can explain large parts of Korea's GDP or patterns or industrialization pattern. In particular, mechanism was the multiple steady state generated by this complementarity and the spillover first. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The discussant is Isabelle Méjean.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me. It's a very interesting workshop and a very interesting paper to discuss. So as you understood, this paper is not about Uganda. It's about a country, South Korea, that has been studied quite a lot as well in this literature. And the reason why South Korea has been studied so much is because it's one of the very few countries that managed to implement this kind of big push and very rapidly converge to this industrialized economy. So this is kind of a puzzle. How did it work in South Korea, and why is it that the same type of policies did not work as well in other countries? So this is a question that has been studied for quite a bit of time. Here I just took a table from a paper by Roderick from the 1995. So there is a whole literature on this, and I'm sure you know it better than I do because I'm a bit of an outlier in this literature. But there are various theories that have been proposed to explain the kind of miracle in South Korea, which is a combination of export-led growth, industrial policy, and some support to private investment that has increased the stock of capital in the country. But what is still unclear from this literature, at least to me, is why did it work in South Korea and not elsewhere? And here there are a lot of possible explanations. It might be that South Korea targeted the right industries, either because these were kind of the latent comparative advantage of the country, or because these were upstream industries that then have benefited to the rest of the economy. Or maybe, and closer to this paper, South Korea managed to target the good clusters, and thanks to this initial push, managed to induce some local spillovers. So this is kind of the story in this paper. So this paper is about adoption of foreign technology and how it increased industrialization through local spillovers. So this is really a fascinating research agenda that is proposed, that is bringing together historical microdata and modern empirical method to revisit a kind of old question. And also, I liked it a lot, a kind of informative quantitative framework that helps digging a bit into the microeconomic mechanism. So in terms of the results, I'm not going to detail too much. So the approach is based on this kind of winners versus losers research design, showing that indeed the winners win a lot from technology adoption, but not all, thanks to spillover. So basically, firms that are sufficiently close to the firms that are adopting those foreign technology are going to benefit from kind of productivity spillovers, and also this is going to increase their own propensity to adopt foreign technologies. And then from the quantitative results, what you get is relatively straightforward. So spillovers in technology adoption generate this type of dynamic complementarities that have been used to justify this type of policies. And obviously, in this type of models in which there are multiple equilibria, what you get is that initial conditions matter, and that's why potentially public subsidies can help moving the economy from a low to a high equilibrium. Sorry. So my main question is actually about the role of these initial conditions. So again, the paper has a possible story for the South Korean miracle, which is that industrial policy managed to target the right clusters, and this helped maximize spillovers. So although I think it's a very reasonable explanation, unfortunately I found that at the end of the day, the geographic dimension is not exploited as much as it could. So as was explained a minute ago, so the data set is really cool with a lot of data, including a very precise mapping of firms to very precise locations, so that you have the whole mapping of firms over time and those that benefit from those spillovers. In the model argues that these initial conditions matter, but the geographic structure is actually quite stylized. So firms are evenly distributed over space, at least within a region. And this means that the calibration and the counterfactual at the end do not really use those very cool fine-grained geographical data. In the data, there is much more that is done because the spillovers are actually identified from this information about geography. But I was a bit frustrated by the fact that the paper does not describe too much this particular dimension that is useful for identification. So in particular, it's not clear to me from reading the paper what is the ex-ante spatial distribution of firms and of firms that were the early adopters, that are the ones that really matter for the later spillovers. So something that I think could be done with this type of data and that I think would be potentially very interesting is to think about a counterfactual world that has different initial conditions, and in particular different initial distribution of firms, and just think about how big the miracle or smaller the miracle would have been if, say, firms were ex ante less clustered in the geographic dimension. So just to give you an idea, it happens that it's a paper about spillovers that doesn't have a map, so I went to the other paper to find a map about South Korea because I'm very bad in geography, and I had no idea about the geography of these policies. But so initially the policy was very much like targeted towards a few areas in the southeast. And now if you look at the structure of industrial production in South Korea, as you can see, of course, it has evolved quite a lot, but these areas remain quite important in terms of the manufacturing industry in South Korea. So clearly, this type of argument that basically clustering has worked in South Korea does not seem to be invalidated by the data, and so I think it would be very interesting to learn a bit more about the importance of geography in the initial stages of the policies. I don't know how much time. I mean, anyway, the rest is really like kind of boring details that you always wonder while looking at this type of papers in which there is a lot in particular to ask about the data. Perhaps the most important has to do with this other paper that Jehu has with Andrei Levchenko, whereby they are looking at the role of public subsidies and loans to individual firms. So I think it would be interesting to learn a bit or to say a bit more about the correlation between this technology adoption and those public subsidies that potentially have helped like finance part of this. Anyway, this is more like out of curiosity. Again, I think it's a very cool paper. I enjoyed a lot reading it, so read it. But at the end of the day, I'm still unsure how did South Korea get it right.
Thank you, Isabelle. Jado, you can answer.
Yeah, I think. Thanks for a great point, Isabel. I think those like exploiting geographic dimension I think future direction that I have to pursue. After finishing the market this year, I have some mental stress working again, but I think it's time to work on exploiting more the geographic dimension of this data set. And also, yeah, I think this paper, when compared to my paper with Andre, this paper trying to looking at a particular mechanism under which industry policy can be successful, rather than the just showing some whether it's success or not. So I think my paper is more like a looking at how industry policy should be conducted in developing economies. And thank you so much for those thoughtful insights. Thanks.
Okay, so questions from the floor. There is Joshua and Imran.
I enjoyed listening to the paper. I was surprised that you are not covering two issues that are well known, I believe, in the literature. First, a lot of the other countries that you referred, and also the discussion referred, are really commodity countries. And it's well known that South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are the opposite. So there is an old story that commodity countries are not a good fit. The second issue, it surprised me, you are not looking at the huge investment in human capital that was needed as the necessary condition, something that is missing in a lot of these countries. So for example, Barry Eichengreen wrote with co-authors a nice paper showing that Turkey failed in the last 10, 20 years to invest in human capital. And of course, if you calibrate your model to Turkey, subsidies will not help Turkey if they are ignoring human capital. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in the first introduction you're saying about Brazil, right? I think I agree. Like some like South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, I think successfully industrialized. And I think there's like still a lot of lessons we can learn. And I think in this paper, I just want to particularly want to pin down technology adoption activities as one of the reasons Korea could have been successful. And also narrative shows that Taiwan and Japan was very active in adopting technologies from United States or Japan at the time. And the second issue, I completely agree with that. Human capital was also very important. But so in my regression model, what I tried to do was that by controlling this region fixed effect, I tried to control this labor market or like something that are common at the aggregate level. So if I add human capital into my model, then it's going to generate even more nonlinearity in my Schoenlein curve because of the even more higher complementarity. So, but I think looking at the human capital is going to be another very important issue in the future. Thank you so much for suggesting that.
So Jado, I wanted to pick up on Isabel's point about trying to understand more about exactly what South Korea get right. And so there were two dimensions that I was puzzled about. I mean, could you say a little bit more about what? Can you say a little bit more about the incentives of foreign firms to agree to these contracts? And what exactly did they get out of it? And does that lead to issues about separating out the effects of FDI versus technology transfer? And secondly, I mean, the contract that you showed was really interesting in terms of transferring both blueprints, technology, as well as workers. Is there more you can say to open up the black box of adoption into those various different channels?
Yeah, thank you so much for suggesting that, Iman. So, first of all, Korea were banning FDI at the time. So they didn't allow for indirect investment. And for the incentive foreign firms to sell their technology, so narrative shows that first narrative, foreign firm didn't expect Korean firm to grow that fast. So Japan, for example, they starting to stop transfer around like 1980 once Korea firms became a competitor in the international market. So that's going to be another point we are going to analyze in our another paper. We kind of modeled strategy interaction between foreign sellers and domestic firms in other paper, which is this stage when Korean firms become competitive enough. But this is more like when Korean firms are still like very minimalistic. Under that, we are kind of simplifying that strategy interaction, but that's very important. And finally, transfer. Yeah, I think if we kind of looking at the more detailed level, whether that was only about labor, like training service or about blueprints, I think that can be another very fruitful direction to uncover this transfer of the knowledge. Thank you for suggesting that.
Other questions?
Thank you very much. A very small question. You talk about technology adoption in South Korean firms. My question, do you take into consideration the intensity of technology adoption and the kind of technology that was adopted? Could we have maybe some few words on that? The intensity, which means we are not in a binary, yeah, 1 and 0, and maybe the kind of technology adopted.
Yeah, so this is a very great point. But for this paper, we're only using the dummy variable. But in the other paper, we are using the actual contract fee between the foreign firms and the domestic firms. But looking at those quality dimensions is also going to be very fruitful. Yeah, thanks for suggesting that.
Thank you very much. Not sure that the question is relevant. My matter is how to ensure that there is no selection bias, since that the firms are selected to have access to subsidies. In this case, there is maybe some endogeneity because the firm that perform and the others are maybe for the non-observable variables, you know.
Yeah, no, so you mean you're talking about the winners versus losers design?
Yes, I'm talking about the
direct gain.
The risk that the firm that don't perform is because they were not selected in the beginning to have access to the subsidies. So the analysis that you do afterward maybe is there is endogeneity.
Yeah, so I think that's a very valid, important point, and that's the reason why I'm kind of trying to do those, trying to tease out those endogeneity issues by carefully matching those winners and losers. But that's at the end, this kind of assumption that we're making, although it's empirically supporting the data, but your concern is valid. Thanks for pointing that out.
I was wondering whether you could say something about the nature of the spillovers that are taking place. Is it going through workers? That's why maybe you have an impact at the local level, or through firm-to-firm relations?
Yeah, thanks for pointing out too. So actually my slide, if I could click, I have some examples. But the engineers of mobility, for example, let's say I'm working in Samsung, and I got adopted new technology, it's at Samsung level, and I learn about that, and I go to, let's say, local capital good producer. And I know the machineries, now I can produce starting that. That's one potential channel. And others is something like a manager's interaction too. So I'm looking at the other firms, oh, this guy adopting technology, and this looks productive and very efficient. I'm going to try to mimic that as a kind of my firm's strategy. So I think that seems to be pretty common at that area during the period. Thanks for pointing it out.
I don't think there are more questions, so I guess this concludes the session. Thanks to the presenters and discussants.